It is quite possible that Australian academic calendar is different than your home country. And if you are a student who is planning to study in Australia in 2024, you need to know about all these major intakes that happen in the Australian universities. So in this video, we will talk about what are the major intakes here in Australia, what are their start dates, end dates, the deadlines for these intakes, what are the benefits and drawbacks of applying to each of these intakes. And if you stick around till the end of the video, I'll talk about some factors you might need to consider when applying for these intakes as well. So if you are ready, I'm ready as well. Let's go. Now, before we get started into these intakes, it's important to understand that some of the universities may have different intake dates than the one we're going to mention here. So it's quite possible that your university may have a different set of intakes, but most of the universities still follow these intakes that we are going to mention. This video is sponsored by Amber Student. More on that a bit later. So the first intake that happened here in Australian University Academic calendar is February-March intake. So if you're going to study in 2024, that will be February-March 2024. And usually this intake is considered to be the biggest intake of the year, as it is the start of a new academic calendar. So this intake usually ends around June. And if you are keen to apply for this intake, most of the universities will have their deadlines between August to November. Right now we are shooting this video in October 2023. So you have around another month before the deadline for this intake expires. So if you want to apply for this intake, make sure to do it as soon as possible, as you're running out of time. Now let's discuss some of the benefits and the drawbacks for applying for this intake. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is the start of the new academic calendar. So it is the biggest intake of the year, which means you will be starting with many other new students who are probably going to be in the similar boat like yourself, brand new to the Australian university system, which is obviously good because you can make new friends and they are also probably on the same page like yourself. Another benefit of studying in this intake is that the weather is usually nicer here in Australia during those months. It is still usually around summertime here in Australia, so you get to enjoy a bit of summer before we get toward autumn and winter. And as it is the biggest intake of the year, there are many events that happen during the orientation time. So you will be able to enjoy a very lively campus experience at the start of the year. And obviously weather does help as well. And one of the major reasons for choosing a Feb intake will be that there will be a lot of courses that are offered during this time. So it is quite possible that some courses or some specific subjects may not be available during the other intakes. But February intake is the start of a new academic year, so you definitely will have a lot more options when it comes to choosing the course, as most of the universities offer all their courses during this intake. Now let's get into some of the drawbacks of starting in Feb intake. The first one is competitiveness. As you can imagine, it is the biggest intake of the year. Many students apply for these intakes, and not only international students but domestic students also will be applying as well, as they usually transition from high school to university system. So expect a lot of competitiveness for the applications, as universities will usually have to go through many competitive applications. So it could be a possibility that if you're applying for a really good university, if they don't have a place for it, then you may have to wait for the next intake. And with this competitiveness, another factor will be higher costs as well. As most of the students in Australia start academic year during this time, you can expect higher cost of living expenses, especially in regards to your accommodation. As many of the students will be looking for accommodation near universities, chances are that you may have to pay higher fee for your accommodation expenses. And that brings us to today's sponsor, which is Amber Student, which is also part of a solution for students who are looking for accommodation. So Amber is a long-term accommodation booking platform for students. Students can find a range of accommodations on the platform. And not only you can find and research it, but you can also book it on the platform itself, which I wish was available when I was an international student. And the good thing about searching on this platform is you can find accommodation near your universities itself. And that comes in without a hassle of negotiations, paperwork, and so on. So they make the whole experience of booking an accommodation for students seamless. If you want to know more about Amber Student and find accommodations through their platform, please check the link in the description box below, where you can find a range of options for booking your accommodation. And thank you, Amber, for sponsoring this video. So again, I want to emphasize that finding accommodation is a bit of challenge already, but during the time of February-March intake, it gets very competitive. All new international students and local domestic students are also looking for accommodation. So it is very important that you try to book that nice and early. And if you want to book one, the link will be in the description box. So that was about the first major intake. Let's move to the second intake, which is also known as July intake or winter intake. So if you missed out on February intake or you just want to apply to the second intake, July 2024 will be the next intake for you. Now usually this intake will end somewhere in October or November 2024, and if you are keen to apply for this specific intake, then you need to be mindful for the deadlines, which is usually between March to May. Now let's discuss on some of the benefits and on some of the drawbacks of this July intake. So one of the biggest benefit will be that if you missed out on February intake because of the competitiveness, then July is definitely your next option. I did apply for myself for the July intake, which was perfect timing as I finished my degree in March, April, and then I managed to apply for July intake. I didn't get the visa in time, so I had to wait for the November intake. But if you were in a similar boat in February, then chances that then you can apply for July intake instead of February. One of the other benefit will be that it gives you time to prepare yourself as well. As some students might not be ready to apply for February, March intake, definitely it's possible that you can apply for a July intake instead. And it also depends upon the academic calendar of your university back home as well. Sometimes July intakes work better in that case. Now let's look at some of the drawbacks of July intake, which is comparing to February intake, there may be less courses offered during this July intake. Don't get me wrong, there will be still plenty of options to choose from when choosing your course in July, but there is a chance that some universities may offer less courses during this specific intake. And apart from that, one of the things I personally don't like is the weather during July, especially if you are living in the southern part of Australia. It gets really cold at that time of the year, so the weather may not be perfect, especially if you don't like such cold weather. It gets quite windy, it can get quite cold, so yeah, it may not be the perfect start to your Australian career. Not saying that people don't like cold weather, it is my personal observation that many other students don't like to start with the cold weather itself. And it's a possibility that with the cold weather, sometimes there is less work available in the market. So there may be less part-time opportunities during the colder months of the year. Now let's move on to the last major intake, which is also known as summer intake in Australia. Now the start date for the summer intake can vary by the university. A lot of universities call it November intake, which will start in November 2024 if you're starting in 24, but it could also start in September, it could also start in October. It just varies depending upon the university, and usually it ends around December 2024 or it could end in January 2025 depending upon when you're starting this specific intake. Now usually the deadlines to apply for this intake will be anywhere from June to August. Again, it varies depending upon when you're actually starting the course. Now the benefits of starting off in November intake will be that there will be small class sizes as there will be fewer students studying in this intake. Usually it's one of the smallest intakes of the year, so expect to have a smaller class sizes, which means you can have some personalized study over there. So there will be personalized attention to the students as there will be fewer students to look after. And comparing to other two intake, it's less competitive, so application process to the university might be a bit simple and easy. And when it comes to weather, it starts getting a bit warmer, so it's definitely a benefit. The drawback is that if you are going to start in November, you can't really take that semester off. You will have to start studying in that specific semester. There's definitely less number of courses offered comparing to February and July intake, as most of the universities will close off many departments as many lecturers and teachers will be on holidays as well. And the orientation may not be as fancy comparing to February or July intake. Now these were the three major intakes and we talked about their benefits and the drawbacks. Now let's look at some of the factors you may need to consider when choosing which intake might be better for you. Now we will divide this into two parts. The first one will be about your personal readiness, and then we'll talk about some other external factors. So let's look at your personal readiness for applying for these intakes. So the first thing to consider will be the preparation time. Do you have enough time to apply for this intake? As you need to prepare many things like documentation. If you haven't got your passport ready, if you haven't got your academic certificates yet, you may not be able to apply. And also apart from documentation, you also have to consider finances. Do you have enough money to apply for the visa, or will you be funding it through sponsorship from your family or through a loan or through some other means of financing? Will you have enough time to look up for these financing options? Then your English test. Have you completed the English tests required by your university? If not, then do you have enough time to apply for these English tests? Medical examination could be another thing you may need to do before coming to Australia. So will you have enough time to get that done? And very importantly is academic timing. So consider that when are you going to finish your course back in your home country? Will that give you enough time to apply for the course in Australia? Or will it lead to a gap here, which may require further explanations if you're applying for studying in Australia? So these were some of the personal factors you need to be mindful of yourself. Now, external factors could include things like course availability. Is the course that you're planning to study available in that specific intake or not? If it's not available, then you may have to look for another intake. University application deadlines. When is the actual application deadline for the university? Now, you might be ready to study in July, but the application deadlines are way ahead of July. So you need to be mindful of those deadlines. The other one will be scholarship opportunities. Sometimes students want to apply for specific scholarships during the year, and these scholarship opportunities may come at only specific times of the year. Like for example, Australia Awards. It's Australia's premium scholarship for international students, but they usually open anywhere from February to April. So you may have to time that right when it comes to scholarship opportunities and also part-time work opportunities as well, which means that which intake may have a better opportunities for you if you are willing to work here in Australia on a part-time basis. So these are some of the factors that you should consider when you're applying for any intake here in Australia. Now, if you want to know which one is the best or the worst intake, we have got that covered in one of our previous videos. So please check this video out that's appearing right now on the screen, where I explain about why we are calling one of these intakes as the worst intake. What are the reasons behind it and my personal take regarding that. So don't miss out, check this video and I'll see you there.